Welcome to episode 82 of the Camerosity podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we are back with another episode. It has only been a few days since episode 81 is posted online, so hopefully each of you have had a chance to let your wallets cool down after what was certainly a tough flare-up of gas. I wonder which one of our listeners was the first to click the Buy It Now button for something we discussed. For tonight's episode, we are going to discuss vintage cameras. Vintage digital cameras, that is. Although something we do often talk about on the show, we haven't dedicated an entire episode to early digital cameras and which models are collectible and worth checking out today. Before we get to that, it's time for some introductions. From Yellow Springs, Ohio, is Paul Reibold, a man who loves all digital cameras, as long as it's his trusty Sony Alpha A7R2. Hey Paul, have you adapted any good lenses to your Sony lately?
Well, Mike, oddly enough that you should ask. I adapted today a 40mm f2.8 kill-fit macro Kylar version E to that camera, and it was spectacular.
I love that lens, and what a coincidence, I just sold that same exact lens. From Sydney, Australia, is your host with the most, Digicams, Theo Panagopoulos. Hey Theo, is choosing a digital camera to take out shooting as hard as choosing a film camera?
Very much so. I in true Theo Panagopoulos style, went and bought 60, 70 of them during when the peak, when the craze was just starting. And now I sit there scratching my head going, oh, which one should I use and use it as a backup camera? It's very hard.
We're going to be without Anthony tonight, as he is currently flying over the Pacific Ocean on his way to Auckland, New Zealand.
It's worth noting with Anthony that he's got a bit of Australia with him today because he's actually on a Qantas plane right now.
Maybe they're serving him some fried kangaroo or something. Who knows? All right, we got a bunch of people in the waiting room. Let's let them in. All right, we have a nice selection of returning callers. For the first time in a while is Larry Effler. Larry, welcome back.
Thank you.
Haven't seen you in a while. How things are with you?
Pretty good. We're sorry for the mess. We're in the process of moving.
Can't see it anyway, so you're good.
Perfect.
All right. And as always, we have AJ.
Hey, guys.
Hey, AJ. Pat Casey's back. Mark Faulkner, Miles, Will Pinkham, and Stephen Strangeways. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
We're doing vintage digital, right? Like, that's a term that's still kind of new, I guess. There's a lot of people that vividly remember the dawn of the digital camera, and it's just hard. We did the 80s episode with episode 80, and I had to point out that, that's 4 decades ago, right? I mean, digital cameras technically got started in the 80s. In that episode, we had talked about the electronic still video cameras, which like the Canon Zap Shot, but those weren't digital. They did not write computer files with ones and zeros that could be read in with a computer. That's the key difference between a still video camera and a digital camera. But the earliest digital cameras, we had episode 25, Steve Sasson on at 1970 working for Kodak, put something together as sort of a busy work project. And people will point out that even what Steve made wasn't the first true digital camera because people were using digital imagers even before him. What he created was the first fully encapsulated device that could capture an image, store it, and then play it back, which, really are the 3 primary qualities that a camera must have. Of course, it would take decades before any real advancements would come through. Late 80s, we saw some very early pioneering models from Fuji, Nikon. Kodak really took the forefront of it. For those who are familiar with the show, you'll already know this, but if you aren't, it might be surprising that of all the companies in the world, the one that had the greatest to lose was Kodak. Certainly other film companies did too, but Kodak's primary business was film. And, if you think about it, for those of us who remember when digital cameras first came out, nobody talked about which type of USB interface it had or which kind of in-camera editing options it had. The big feature was, you mean I don't have to develop film anymore? I mean, that was the big deal. So to think that the one company that had the greatest to lose was Kodak, yet they were the company that really pushed the technology along. In fact, most, not all, but most of the very early devices used Kodak technology in them. They didn't build the whole cameras, but they would partner with companies like Nikon and Canon, and they would sort of make these hodgepodge cameras that would sort of have film parts with a digital back and such like that too. And those were really the first true digital cameras that people actually started to use in the 90s, and even into the first decade of the 21st century. So we're going to probably focus on mostly that. We'll get into some of the models from the early 2000s. Steven's here. I'm really excited to have him here because he's got a lot of knowledge that I don't have, that I think will be really interesting, talking about some of those early technologies and sort of how we got to where we are. I would love to hear each of you. What are some of your favorite models? Is there a particular one from that era that you're particularly fond of? A technology, a feature, and maybe if we have some time, we'll talk about some of the more bizarre models, because there certainly were a few of those too. So instead of me continuing to ramble, why don't I just kind of start with someone in the room here? And does anybody have a particular model or a question or something that they thought would be a good way to start off the show?
So the very first digital camera I used was a Apple QuickTake 100. It was built by the company with the most to lose, Kodak, and the company that ended up with the most to gain, Apple. And it was a $1,000 or $700 camera that took a 1/3 megapixel picture. I worked for a TV station that was kind of progressive, and we were building our own website in the mid 90s, right? Before anybody else was really trying to make their own in-house. And before that, we would take our big video cameras out in the field to shoot still photos. We'd roll off 5 seconds of video and come back and digitize it in our editing system that we charged hundreds of dollars an hour to use. Our web guy finally convinced the management to buy him that $1,000 camera that took 640 by 480 pictures. And I went out and documented the triangle area in the mid 90s with that camera. You get about 8 images, and we carried a laptop so we could download them and then shoot eight or nine more, and download it and shoot 8 or 9 more. And they were that's how we built our website.
People would talk about the early digital cameras. The big deal was, the images aren't as good of quality. It would take a while, at least compared to 35 millimeter, where digital cameras actually could equal and then eventually surpass. If you look at some of the very earliest digital cameras, they don't look that good. You might wonder, like, well, why would anybody really invest in that technology, especially in the 90s? Like, obviously it was like proof of concept stuff, auto show kind of things, like gee whiz technology. But a story that I heard that I thought was actually kind of interesting was 1991, the Gulf War. Nikon had released, or with Kodak, they released a camera with Nikon called the DCS 100. This was based off of the Nikon F3, and it sold for, I think I read somewhere, 30 grand in 1991 dollars, which is ridiculous. If you look up a picture of the DCS 100, it's not just a digital camera. It comes with like a remote storage device with a hard drive in it, a remote power supply, all these complicated power, SCSI cables. Like it had like a briefcase. I mean, it was a whole system. But where that camera really like sharpened its teeth was during the Gulf War. For the first time ever, we had some people that were able to take an image and then within the hour electronically transmit that file back to wherever headquarters were, New York, London, whatever, and they could, the press, the newspapers could start printing that image within an hour of it being taken. And I mean, that right there is such a thing that we've taken for granted with digital photography, with smartphones and such. But when that day came, when that very first digital image of something, a Scud missile or whatever, came across, and this was taken 15 minutes ago and they're already starting to print, that is game changing. And I think those images even were black and white, but that really didn't matter though. For relatively, newspaper images aren't of the highest quality. They didn't care that the resolution wasn't as good as what you get with 35 millimeter. It was just that speed. And if you were a professional or a private photographer and you had one of those cameras, 30 grand was a lot of money, even after you adjust it for inflation. But you probably could charge a pretty hefty premium if you were one of those first people to be able to do that and get those images instantly. Because that's, with news, the faster whoever's first to release something, you're the king. So a lot of what you'll hear when you research early digital cameras, especially the ones from the 90s, they were exclusive to press. consumers, photographers really didn't hear about this stuff until probably the late 90s. And even then, they were so far beyond what most people could afford. No one really ever saw those kinds of things. But that's where really Kodak was really pushing the limits of what the technology could do. And with each new model, they gained significant improvements, adding rear LCDs, switching from hard drives to PCMCIA cards to eventually flash memory, more megapixels, stuff like that. So the quick take was, when did that come out?
No, it came out in 95, Mike. The thing is that what you're saying is correct. I mean, it's all true as far as professionals, but for the consumer standpoint, Kodak was 1995. They came out with the DC-20, and then the DC-120 in 96, and the DC-240 in 97. Those cameras were, and that's the Apple QuickTake 100 also. Those cameras were actually made by Chinon, because Kodak they made the guts, but the cameras themselves were made by Chinon. Those were consumer grade cameras. They were not really oriented toward the professional. The DCS cameras were the digital computer science cameras. They were made for pro use. And Mike, which one is that? The 420?
The 420.
Yeah. Okay.
And you said there was like two paths of research. The professional cameras had to look like cameras and look like professional cameras, but the consumer cameras were wild shapes and tried new things. Like the quick take looked like a pair of binoculars, or they took as an opportunity to reinvent the wheel.
Like they're like bridge cameras, like we talked about last episode.
Yeah, on Kodak, when Kodak came out with them, they were working with a blank sheet of paper. They were actually really simple cameras. That they got into a little farther out stuff when they went into the Easy Share line, but that was several years past the DC series. The DC 120 was, I believe, the first with a zoom. The DC 40 might have had a zoom too. So they were pretty innovative back in that time, and none of the camera manufacturers had yet gone into digital to the same extent. They were relying on Kodak to come out.
One of the big what ifs I've always had about Eastman Kodak, they were at the same time pushing APS, if I remember the timing correctly, and they dumped a boatload of research and development into that, because obviously that's what they now film, and that was supposed to be sort of the best of both worlds. But one of the what ifs, what if they hadn't done that? What if they would have said digital? But I guess the problem was there was just not the profit in hardware, and that's always Eastman Kodak's problem. They didn't make money on hardware. I mean, is that accurate to say that's why they didn't jump onto this even harder than they did?
No, I think you got the cart before the horse, before the cart before the horse. The APS was actually developed and promoted by the camera manufacturers.
Okay.
Kodak was along for the ride because Kodak had to supply the film. Fuji, of course, also supplied the film. Konica supplied the film. So the manufacturers made that decision to promote the APS cameras. And, there was a lot of angst when they were coming out, because there was, dealers and were not completely on board with it. And the labs were certainly not on board with it because they had to retool. They had to spend a lot of money for new processing equipment. So APS, there was a lot of talk in the industry that this could kill the industry. When APS was all the manufacturers put a lot of money into it. And I think, frankly, it probably did severely damage some of the companies, especially like Minolta.
Minolta, of all the manufacturers, Minolta had the greatest stake from the hardware side. And you can see that because they had some of the most feature-rich cameras, like the Vectis, whereas like companies like Nikon, their first attempts were just kind of basic model. They eventually had the Pronia, but a lot of those early APS cameras were of the simple point and shoot variety. They didn't even take advantage sometimes of all the features it had. But what Paul said is absolutely right. There were, I think, because I did a little article on APS, I want to say there were as many as 40 different companies that were all in, like Fuji was involved in it too. APS was definitely not a Kodak product. Kodak was more along like there, like to steer it. They wanted their input, because remember that 110, the Pocket Instamatic, the 126 Instamatic, even the Type 135, the daylight loading cassette, your typical 35 millimeter cassette, these were all Eastman Kodak products. They developed those cassettes. But with APS, that was a committee design. And of course, anytime you get too many people, too many cooks in the kitchen, nobody can agree. It took, I think I read somewhere, it took 8 years from the initial conception of APS to when the first thing started to appear. So you got, if that's true, and APS came out in early 96, you're talking 1988 when the first vestiges of APS were in development.
And they were cheap cameras. They were the Kodak Advantixes
Yeah.
and I mean, really very low end consumer type cameras. But at the same time, this was going on. The development of the digital cameras, consumer grade digital cameras, were also beginning to happen. And Stephen probably can, I'd be interested to hear his take on this. The biggest problem was the development of the chips because the flaw rate on sensors was extremely high. And that's why sensors were so small to begin with. They could not make, people say, well, we want a 24 by 36 sensor. It just couldn't happen because there were too many defects in a sensor of that size. The throwaway rate on them was very, very high at the beginning. Does that sound right to what you've?
Yeah, definitely. A CCD sensor was an especially difficult thing to produce compared to other chips. And what we see in CMOS sensors now, that basically anybody could make one if they had chip fabrication capabilities. But a CCD sensor was very difficult. And that's why a company like Kodak invested a ton of money into producing them. And for a while, lots of other companies were using their sensors. And there were really only maybe two or three companies capable of making those sensors. Very small yields, very high prices. It was quite a difficult thing.
I guess then the question I've always had is, okay, why did Eastman throw that away? And I keep falling back. Isn't it because they didn't make as much money on hardware, therefore they didn't stay with it? I mean, is that accurate to say?
Well, when we're kind of talking about consumer cameras, like early digital consumer cameras, really it was businesses that were grabbing onto this new technology. When you had sports or news photographers, a lot of them were shooting 35 millimeter film and developing it, in their bathrooms and sending it back as a wire image, or you had a team at a newsroom or a sports game that was developing film, and that was all sorted. The use of a digital camera to take pictures really quickly was kind of a rare thing. And with consumers, they were happy with film, and you had them shooting one roll of film in a year and dropping their film off, getting prints. They were happy with that. So APS seemed like a great solution to that. But where those early digital cameras really took off was businesses that needed quick turnaround to get images back to, like, someone working for a company to send things back to a company for presentation or to use on a website or in a printed company report, that didn't have their own developing facilities, didn't want to have to go to a camera store and get their film developed and processed.
Insurance claims.
Yeah, insurance claims.
That's where it transitioned into Sony. Because when Sony came out with the Mavica that wrote to the floppy disk, that was the death knell for Polaroid. Because at that time, every insurance adjusters, realtors, body shops, police departments, anybody that was previously using a piece of Polaroid film could now save that piece of film and shoot it on the Mavica. And the quality was, the printers were getting better, but it was as good as it needed to be.
Yeah.
Plus, it was a lot easier to share if you needed to send something to somebody.
The digital Mavica that Paul's talking about was, when we think of the most significant cameras in the history of photography, certainly the Kodak Brownie would be in there. The Leica would be in there, probably the Nikon F. But I would say this, because while there were certainly plenty of digital cameras that came out before these are the floppy disk Mavicas that started coming out in, I think, 96, 97 maybe. This was the one camera that if you were a consumer, we're talking about here, the volume purchaser, this would have been your first exposure to what digital photography could do, right? Now, the image quality on these, I'm holding, I forget what model this is. This is one of the later ones. The FD88 is what this one is.
I've got the FD7 here, which is the floppy disk one, which is a 0.3 megapixel.
Yeah, the FD5, I think, was the first. So I think yours was the second version, Theo.
Yeah. So mine's a later one with a 1.3 megapixel image, and that's still pretty low quality. I mean, you see Mark, what do you have there?
This is
2.0?
a two. Yeah, it's FD200. Yeah.
0.3 megapixel is the size of a TV image.
Yeah, and that's what they were used for. These cameras were really made to be used to look at the image on a computer screen. It really was not something that was suitable for printing, though you
No.
could print them. It was really meant to be shared on a computer screen.
But for the first time ever, regular people had access to somewhat affordable digital computers, and you could delete the images. There was no, other than floppy disks, there was no recurring costs that you had to keep paying. You could email the files and they were sufficient. The early World Wide Web, these images were good enough to be on websites and such too. And that, I think, right there is what really kickstarted the digital world.
I was about to say exactly the same thing. It's actually, from a consumer point of view, people were quite happy to keep having prints coming out, doing 1 or 2 films a year and getting their prints done. But as soon as the internet took hold and people wanted to share images, that's where digital really came into its own, because suddenly the demand for images, not just your printed albums, became so great that you needed something that you could actually have quickly and available, and you could share with people everywhere.
Because they weren't produced for that long, the very last digital Mavicas wrote to tiny CDs, only because even Mark's 2.0 megapixel one, that's like 6 images per disc. It very quickly outgrew the capacity of a floppy, so they had to switch to mini CDs, which could hold, I think, 300 megabytes per disc, which gave you more capacity. But by that point, the technology was progressing so fast. Think back to SLR design in the 1950s. Basically, every year, brand new features were coming out. What was state of the art 1957 was old by 1958. That same thing was happening in the late 90s, around the turn of the century, in digitals. And while the Sony Mavicas were great and extraordinarily popular, and like Paul said, they basically were the death toll for Polaroid, the technology surpassed them so quickly that their place in history, it seems small, only in like a 4, maybe 5-year window. But what the digital Mavica did to progress us to where we are today, I think that was the model. And it was strange because Sony wasn't seen as a photography company until that point. They made camcorders, but I don't really think they ever made a still camera, or if they did, it wasn't popular.
They made chips, but you're right. That was the Mavica was their first real foray into digital. And the CD cameras you mentioned, the CDR 300, those cameras were actually a step backwards in some ways because the FD was so simple and so almost foolproof. But the CDR cameras, if you moved the camera while it was writing to the disk, you could corrupt the file. And also, if you forgot to finalize the disk, you'd overwrite what you'd written previously. So there were all kinds of flaws and failures to the CD cameras that really they were not, they didn't hang around very long. But it wasn't long after that Sony went away from that and went into more mainstream type small cameras.
The funny thing is that at the time, a floppy disk was the only affordable storage medium that you could swap out. Like Larry was saying, of having cameras with a built-in memory where you could take 8 or 9 photos and you'd have to connect them to a computer. That was very common in the late 90s. And even when cameras started getting removable cards, you would have such a great expense to them that most people couldn't afford to have a whole bunch of cards or even one large card. So the Mavica, recording to floppy disks, people used to have pouches full of floppy disks that they could shoot 80 images to a stack of floppies. And that was the first sort of large storage format that was available to people. And later on, as you got memory cards, things like smart media, one of the accessories they made was a floppy disk adapter where you could put this smart media card from your Olympus or Fuji camera into a floppy disk that had batteries, put that in your computer, because they thought people liked floppy disks as an easy way to get things into your computer. It wasn't cables, it was a medium that you were familiar with. And none of those really took off because it was actually, for the Mavica, it was just the fact that you could buy a whole bunch of floppy disks really cheaply.
And storage was easy. You just keep the disks. When you got into the more, when you went into the removable storage, then you were into the PCMCIA cards, which were good cards, but they were extremely expensive per megabyte. I mean, there was no such thing as a 1 gig card. I mean, they were all five megs or 10 megs. And as I recall, we were selling PCMCIA cards were $700 to $1,000 for a 10 megabyte card. I mean, it was just crazy.
PCMCIA, that technology was both flash memory, but then they also had these things called micro drives, where it was literally a hard drive, a shrunken down hard drive that fit on basically a flash card.
They were the size of a compact flash card.
Yeah.
And they were a little thicker, but they would fit into a camera. Of all the memory cards that has been made, all the different Bernoulli boxes, every storage device you can think of, the worst was probably either smart memory, smart media, or CF. The CF cards had about 50 little holes that had to match up to 50 pins inside the body. And if you didn't push them straight in from the very center of the card, it was very likely you were going to bend one of the pins inside the body.
And God forbid it was raining.
Oh, if you got any kind of moisture or anything into the holes on the card, then you would short it out when you fired it up.
You look at the digital Mavic was writing the floppy disks. The cool thing about that is floppy disks already existed. That was not a new technology. They were writing the media that chances are you already have. So fast forward only a couple years and we've moved on to flash memory, which for most purposes is better. It's faster, much higher capacity, rewrite as many times as you want. But like what Paul's saying is everybody had their own way of doing it. You know, Sony wanted everybody to use memory stick. The one you were holding up, AJ, was that a smart media? The real thin
exactly.
one?
Yeah, and that's for my Fuji.
Aren't there like 3-volt and 5-volt versions of that card too? And you had to pay attention to which one you had?
Yeah, Fuji had one and Sony or Olympus had the other.
And Olympus had the other one.
That was a problem. And the other thing is, Mike, that those cards are very fragile too, because you have all your gold contacts are right hanging out there in the breeze. I mean, it's right there.
And just look how thin they are.
Yeah.
I've got one left that I'm guarding with my life.
I've got two.
It lives in a Tupperware container wrapped in paper towels.
So for us weirdos that like to still play with these old digital cameras, that's one thing where as collectors, film's better. You know, get a Leica from the 30s, send it off to be cleaned, and it's going to come back to you working as good as new. You don't have to jump through any hoops, but getting this, Theo, I'm looking at you because I know you've done it too. Stephen, you have one of these as well. So the Minolta RD175, to get this thing to work is really difficult. I mean, for one, you need a very specific type of card. It does accept the little hard drives we were talking about. In this segment, I keep saying that the Minolta RD175 uses compact flash. This is not true. It actually uses PC cards, but I was using a compact flash adapter, which is why I got confused. But it does take compact flash. But you can't just stick any compact flash in there. Not only do you need a specific kind of compact flash, but that compact flash has to be formatted with some goofy proprietary file system that Minolta had came up with back then, which wasn't a big deal. But I think, Theo, you and I use the same method of there's like an ISO or something out there. Someone saved a copy of that file structure, and there's a website you can go to. I have it on my site. I've mirrored it. But it allows you to download an image of that original disc. And then with the right tool, you can flash. When I say flash, I mean like write the image from the computer file you downloaded onto the flash card so that when you stick it in the camera, it thinks that you have an original memory card and allows you to work. And even then, after you write the files, this doesn't save JPEGs. Do you remember the file extension, Theo? Or
you had to get some sort of weird converter program to actually convert it over. But I have to correct you on something there, Mike.
Okay.
You said it was really difficult. I will tell you that that's actually sugarcoating it, because I actually were comparing, saying, would I rather have a colonoscopy or go through this again? It was that bad. It was such a experience that every step of the way you're hitting technology that is just gone. It's just not there anymore. And you've got file converters that do claim to do every single file format in the world, and you go there and they've never heard of this one.
Right. Yeah. Photoshop will not read these native files in. You have to use this And like I said, we're just lucky that someone has figured out a way to get these programs to still work. So you can still shoot that camera today, but you're essentially, after you've done all the hoops of everything. Steven, have you shot yours?
I have, and
Yeah.
yeah, getting it to work was such a pain because at the time that I got mine, people had figured out how to work it with the ISO images and things, and there were forum posts, there was information online, but all of the links were dead. So there were all these links to download this program, download this ISO image, and none of them worked. And I signed up for old forums, sent messages to people that were probably had never logged on in the last 5 years, asking, does anybody have this file? Does anybody have this file? And it took me about a year to be able to finally, through a YouTube video, track down someone to send me the file.
Yeah.
And finally got it working. I'm glad to hear that you've mirrored it. But that's the other
Yes.
thing is, even if the knowledge exists out there, and if you can pull up an old web page through the web archive, links to files, to software, drivers, ISO images, those can all disappear, and it can be
Yeah.
so hard to get something running.
The Wayback Machine is not good at attachments.
The digital version of 620 film, it was Minolta's way to make you buy their card.
Well, I would say it would be worse than 620. It would be 620, but it uses a chemical like Kodachrome. It'd be like if Kodachrome was on 620, that might be at least a closer analogy, because like to get it to work, even you have to jump through so many hoops just to get an image. And like, again, and I'm not knocking it, because what that camera could do for its day was pretty neat. The image quality is not that great. It's worse than probably the pictures from my very first cell phone camera. You know, like the earliest flip phones that had like the 1 megapixel.
Put it this way: if you like highlights, don't use this camera.
Right, yeah.
Get pretty much every highlight blown out.
Within the same image, you'll have muddy blacks and blown out highlights in the same image. There's no dynamic range at all.
But then we have, in the 80s, late 80s, then we had the Joint Photographic Experts Group, who came up with the standardized file, the JPEG, that's so well loved today. But before that, along with that, there were also a lot of different RAW formats that were not all compatible with each other. So Nikon would have their NEF files, Canon would have their RAF files, Fuji had something different. So there was no standardization among the RAW files to begin with. And then the software manufacturers began to do updates. Every time somebody would make a tweak to the camera RAW file, they would come out with another fix for it. So that became, but the JPEGs were great because a JPEG was a JPEG all over the world. I mean, they were always going to be readable.
Macintosh and IBM had two different versions of TIFF. That's right.
Yeah, and when you formatted a card, sometimes you had to format it depending on which system you were going to be using it in.
Yeah,
and even with the TIFFs and the RAW formats, they were a pain to use because they took so much processing power. I remember I was actually doing some wildlife photography in Kenya at one point, and I came across a photographer. This was in 2004, who'd actually swapped over to digital. And he said, like, yeah, all the agencies kept insisting they have to provide files in TIFF format, and because obviously they're looking for quality. And he said, look, I just can't do it. I'm out in the field. I'm in the dirt. I've got lions around ready to eat me or something. He said, I can't spend the time doing that. So he was actually shooting in JPEG and converting him to TIFF and uploading him, and no one caught on. He was still getting like covers of magazines.
Everybody did. Just every still photographer on the side of a football field, they were shooting in JPEG because they didn't want to have to reload at halftime, and then had an assistant go convert it to a TIFF and make them think it was shot as a RAW.
Well, and the other part of that story is that the cameras were very slow to write back then. The memory cards themselves were slow, and their buffers in the cameras. You couldn't shoot, 4 frames you couldn't shoot 4 consecutive frames in a RAW format or even a TIFF. You might be able to get 6 or 8 in a JPEG. So for a sports or wildlife photographer, it was critical that you shoot in JPEGs.
Paul, you had one of those Nikon, was it the 900s, or that one of those twisty cameras?
Yeah, the 900, 950.
Yeah. Did you ever try shooting that in TIFF format?
No.
I tried that, and 2 minutes later, you're still watching this.
It was still writing it. Yeah.
Yes.
Because those cameras were limited in the card type they could use too.
One of my favorite quirky early ones, maybe I can get to a little bit later, is the Sony DSC F828. This is a really neat camera, but it's 8 megapixels. And this camera came out in '03. And I've shot this thing before. And when it writes in RAW, whatever format it is, it's like 5 to 10 seconds per image to write it. And this is from 2003. So if it's taking up to 10 seconds for a single image in 2003, these 90s cameras were probably up to a minute or longer, because again, like Paul said, not only is the hardware slow, but the write speeds of those early flash drives were slow too.
And that Mike, that used the super memory stick, didn't it? Or actually,
Yeah.
I think it used two different
It
colors.
had a couple.
Yeah.
This one supports compact flash
Right.
and memory stick. So thankfully, even by this point, as much as I've often been a fan of Sony over the years, but Sony does have a bad history of coming up with their own proprietariness for stuff. And, it's their way or the highway sometimes for these dead end ones. And memory stick, as we know, didn't last. But thankfully, this model uses just regular compact flash cards.
And it has a nice party trick with the infrared where you can put a magnet on the side and get it to leave. The filter pops out of the way.
Have either of you done that? I've been trying to. I just can't seem to make it work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ekman.
What was it, Mike? Weren't you able to shoot through people's clothing also with that model?
That's what they said. Yeah, it's not like X-ray vision, but like it would detect like nipples. If you're wearing like a light colored shirt, it could detect the different colors of skin. I mean, it's just a little bit about that feature is all digital sensors. And Stephen could probably correct me if I get it wrong, but the human eye sees the visible spectrum of light, right? Roy G. Biv. Okay, but as we all know, there's light lower than the wavelengths and higher wavelengths. Digital sensors can see beyond the visual spectrum of light. However, if the digital sensors are interpreting all these different wavelengths and writing them all to a file, you have unnecessary information, which is going to alter the look of the image. So they make digital sensors, they put a filter over it that filters out everything you don't need, right? So it's blocking UV light, it's blocking infrared light. Am I still correct, Stephen? Am I right?
You're right.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. So that's how all digital cameras, even the ones today, are just like that, right? You have to modify the sensors to only take the wavelengths that you want. Well, people who like to shoot infrared photography, because the filter there is blocking that out, you have to remove that filter. So you'll see people who will modify some digital cameras and open them up and physically peel off that filter so that all the spectrum can get in there. And then you could put a real IR filter over the lens so that only the IR light can get to the sensor and then it can write it, whatever. Okay. So Sony had the filter just like before, but Sony had a ton of experience with their camcorders. And when you're shooting in, for those of you who had like a Sony camcorder, a lot of times they had night vision. It wasn't real night vision, but essentially what it was is the sensor that was in that camera could see the IR spectrum. And how they did that is they put the filter, but it was just on a hinge and it could flip up and out of the way, or maybe it went to the side. I don't know. I'm waving my hands in the air like an idiot. But basically that filter could be moved out of the way, allowing all light to get through. And that was a feature they had on a lot of their camcorders. And again, because Sony was not really a camera company, or a still camera company, I should say, when they started making their own digital cameras, they said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we incorporated that feature into our camera? And it works really, really well. You can see nipples, but there are other cool uses for it too. Like you can actually expose and flash an image in 100% darkness and it'll focus, it'll expose properly, everything. It's a really cool feature. But, and I'm sure they didn't do this on purpose, if you take a strong enough, like a neodymium magnet and put it in a very specific spot, the magnetism moves that filter out of the way unintentionally. And it allows you to operate the camera. Yeah, Larry's pointing to it. It's on the side of the lens, right near the caution risk of electric shock sticker. It's about in that area next to the tripod mounts. You put the magnet in that right spot and the filter swings up out of the way and it allows you to activate the night mode, but in normal light. And because the filter ring allows you to screw on just a normal filter, you go buy you could either do the variable ones or a fixed one, and you can, in essence, shoot digital infrared photography without modifying the camera at all. You want to put it back to normal, you just take the magnet off and it automatically reverts back to how it was. I don't know that anybody did that back then. Maybe they did. I have no idea, but that's kind of like the cult status of this model. It's the 8. There were 3 of them. The 828. There was one called the 707. I can't remember, 606, 605, something like that. There were 3 of them that could do it.
The 707 and there was one more between it and the 828.
Yeah.
717.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah, because the other thing, Mike, is those cameras had Zeiss lenses on them.
They do. Yep.
They were
Carl Zeiss.
really, really good lenses.
This one's a Vario sonar. It's a 1-inch sensor, so it's 7.1 to 51 millimeters, which is like 28 to I think 135 or something like that. Maybe longer.
Like 6 megapixels, 6 or 8 megapixels.
8 megapixel. But it's a maximum aperture of f2. So wide open at the wide angle lens, you could shoot f2 with Sony Carl Zeiss glass. It writes RAW files. It supports compact flash media. It's got the gimmicky but neat, night shot mode. The lens and the shutter swivel independently of the body. So, if you want to shoot waist level, you just tilt the body down so you're looking at the rear LCD or the optical viewfinder while the lens is still facing forward. You could operate the camera almost like a waist level camera too. So this is, in my opinion, one of the neatest early digital cameras that I love playing with.
But even if you look at earlier cameras like that RD175 Minolta, it has very weak IR filtration. And a lot of the early reviews complained about the white balance in daylight, but it was okay under tungsten. And what it actually was its IR contamination that you were seeing in daylight sources that you didn't get in tungsten light bulbs. It's kind of a magenta color cast of things, or artificial black fabrics. People's clothing, camera bags, and plastics and things would turn purplish. And sure enough, if you put an IR blocking filter, a hot mirror filter in front of that camera, images look fantastic. That problem goes away because it was just weak filtration. And another one that was famous for it that people actually kind of knew about was the C2000 from Olympus in like 1999. People would just shoot that camera unmodified, put a filter that blocked visible light in front of it, and take some IR pictures. And later models, by the time they got to the 3000 series, they had much stronger IR blocking. So it was almost like this thing that camera manufacturers didn't quite figure out in the 90s and early 2000s. Then they caught on to it by 2003 or so with the 828. Everything had pretty strong IR blocking filters, and Sony made that one that you could remove the filter from with the magnet trick. But one of the places that still exists is cell phones. A lot of cell phones have very poor IR filtration just because they're squeezing things into such a small space. And one of the things I kind of notice is looking at cameras online, there are a couple of cameras that, depending on the type of plastic they use, they actually have the black plastic show up looking purple if a picture is taken of them with a cell phone. So I can look on eBay listings and be like, oh, that camera looks purple because that photo was taken either with a very early digital camera or these days a cell phone.
I wish I'd actually known about that, Stephen, back then, because I just assumed it was the conversion process of those files. But that's actually quite interesting. It explains on the RD175. I did actually get that purplish in the blacks.
Yeah, I got a hot mirror filter, a Tiffin hot mirror filter that looks kind of like a normal color, and it just reflects IR light, and the images look fantastic. These days, they're pretty expensive and hard to find, and what you find more often are the filters that also have kind of a cyan cast to them. Just looking at them naturally, they're a very cyan-looking filter, and those are too strong. Those impart too much of a color cast on them. So it's expensive, but possible to get a really nice hot mirror filter for the RD175.
Yeah, it was our hot mirrors were a thing back in those days, and Mike's Leica M8 also worked very well with a hot mirror filter.
What's a hot mirror filter?
A hot mirror filter is one that reflects infrared light, hot being hot temperature as in IR light, and rather than a lot of filters absorb certain wavelengths of light, but it's a dichroic filter that actually reflects it.
And it looks like a dichroic filter when you look at it. It'll give you a sheen when you look at it under reflected light.
And the problem with those is they're not even from the center to the edges. So a lot of lenses are okay, but if you get something really wide angle, the edges of the frame, the light's coming through at a different angle and is imparting a different color cast at the edges of the frame. It can be quite terrible.
On smaller sensors, that wasn't a big deal, but you're right. When they went to the full frame sensor, you had to everything had to change when they went to the full frame sensor because the light was hitting the sensor in a totally different manner. And then also back at that time, there were a lot of little cottage industries like Hidden Light and places that did infrared conversions. They would take your camera. A lot of Fujis were done that way. They would take off remove the filter in front of the sensor and also snip a couple of wires. And so it read IR only. So that was another thing that was a big deal.
Now, Stephen, you mentioned the early CCD sensors. Some had poor IR filtration, and maybe they interpreted the colors differently. You also said that the early CCD sensors were expensive and difficult to mass produce. Is that what the switch, roughly around 2010, it seemed like we moved to the CMOS sensors? Was that an improvement with the newer sensors, or like what drove that change?
Well, in a lot of cases, that was companies that wanted to be able to make their own sensors driving that change. Canon was one company that developed their own CMOS sensors and to this day still makes them. Nikon tried. They had one camera. Well, the D2H and the D2HS had their own in-house developed CMOS sensor, basically. And it was something that the basic chip fabrication that can make integrated circuits and microchips and semiconductors, transistors, that sort of thing, you could manufacture it in-house and do it on your own. Whereas for a CCD sensor, you really had to go to somebody else to buy it for most camera manufacturers. So that pushed some of the companies to try and develop their own. And the other thing was that a CMOS sensor is something that draws less power and can work more quickly. So it's really something that you need for live view. And although you had lots of compact CCD cameras that would do live view, that was something that was only possible because of their small sensor size. So if you want to do a large sensor that can do video, that can do live view, it's got to be CMOS.
Right, because early on the CCD sensors, it could only write a certain amount of time before it would shut down because it developed so much heat, and the CMOS sensors didn't have that problem. And the Canon was, like as you say, was a major manufacturer of those chips, and unfortunately, it also meant that if they made an error, everybody got the same error, and that happened back in the early 2000s when the sensors failed. Yeah.
Sony that did that. And that's, I think, when everyone kind of realized just how many companies were using Sony sensors when pretty much every camera manufacturer had a recall on their cameras.
Sony, actually, the Canons were the worst. Second worst were the Fujis, the Fuji S series cameras, the S2 and S all the way up to the S5.
Is that what plagued the Leica M9, or is that a different problem?
It was the same issue, but a different problem. It was the sensor cover glass on the M9 that went bad.
Wouldn't it like oxidize or something?
Yes, it delaminated. No, actually, the Sony chip delaminated. On the Sony or on the Leica, it oxidized, and the result was similar, but not exact.
Stephen, your analogy, or not analogy, but your reference to live view makes perfect sense because 2010 is like right when that was a hot feature to have. And for anybody who might be listening to this show who wasn't into digital cameras pre that era, it's worth noting that what live view is just the ability to use the LCD to actually see the what you're looking at. Because, if you're talking about like a SLR back then, they still worked like film cameras did, and that you had a reflex mirror that redirected the light up into a pentaprism, and you were looking at the optical light passing through the lens. And then when you fired your shutter, just like in a film camera, the reflex mirror would swing out of the way, the shutter would open, there would be your digital sensor, it would capture your image, the shutter would close, the mirror would flip back down, just like in a film camera. But with live view, that allowed you to actually use the digital sensor to operate the rear LCD like we do today. And, for film collectors, you go back far enough, things like an instant return mirror or an auto resending exposure counter. There's a lot of hell in cars, turn signals. Cars didn't used to have turn signals. At one point in time, power windows and air conditioning and turn signals and headlights, even those were considered new features that the earliest automobiles didn't have. Well, if you go back to 2005 and got a DSLR, it did not have live view. You could not compose your image while you're shooting with the rear LCD. And that's, everybody wanted live view. They wanted to be able to use the DSLRs just like a point and shoot. Mm-hmm. And from what Stephen's saying is a combination of factors, one of which was lower power and being able to keep that sensor constantly operating in order to feed the rear LCD was probably what's moved that switch.
And live view was necessary for the cameras to shoot video. And
that too, yeah.
And about the time that every newspaper started having a website, the news photographers were pressured to shoot video too. You didn't have to, shoot a TV story, but you had to come back with some moving image of the story that you were covering. They were looking for carrying one camera instead of two.
If you go way back in live view, the Fuji FinePix S3 Pro, which was a DSLR based on a Nikon F80 or N80 film body, it introduced live view in a DSLR, and it was great for focusing. It was given as an idea that you could just switch this on, check your focus very carefully. The limitations of it was that it was black and white, and it only ran for, I think it was 30 seconds before it overheated. So you'd switch on live view and the screen would be showing 30, 29, 28 and counting down. And that was it.
Oh my.
When that counter reached zero, it would drop the mirror, close the shutter and shut off. And you had to wait a little bit for it to cool down and then start another live view session to get another 30 seconds of seeing what the sensor was seeing.
Would the temperature of the sensor have an impact on the quality of the image?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's where some of the noise comes from.
Even with CCD cameras, one of the things about them is they have an amplifier that is on the circuit board but separate from the sensor, and it generates a lot of heat. And if you looked at early CCD cameras, most cases they'd be perfectly fine. But if you start to do long exposures, like 1 minute or 2 minute long exposures, you would get what was called amp glow, which was that a corner of your image would start having a purple glow to it. And that was because of the heat that was being built up on the amplifier. And if it was something like in the top of your photo, that meant that the amp was at the bottom of the chip, because the image would be reversed when it was hitting the lens. And you had to worry about that for long exposures.
And in the beginning of digital photography for astronomy, believe it or not, and I worked with a few guys in the States who had big setups, we'd actually get, literally, you guys are going to laugh, a huge garbage pail, throw a third of the depth in ice, fill it halfway up with water, put a fountain pump in the bottom of the bucket, and the actual CCD sensor had an inlet and an outlet. There was a radiator that was stuck on the back of the sensor, and we used that to cool down the sensor so that we could attain a good 5 or 10 minute exposure and have the least amount of noise possible.
Jeez. Wasn't there a problem with early digital cameras for people who are into astro star photography where the noise reduction would delete the stars?
Absolutely. And that's where now you have a second noise reduction function. It's based on time. Anything over a second, what happens is, because what we do, we call it taking a dark frame. So what we do is we close the shutter, take the same exposure, and just register the blown out pixels. Because what would happen is the noise reduction for the ISO, because of the algorithm, it would remove stars. And a lot of times those stars were the stars we used to figure out where the hell we are pointing the telescope.
The real problem was the Sony cameras that were infamous for the star eater problem, is that they do their own digital noise reduction and they would bake it into the raw file. So there was no way to turn it off. There was no way to avoid it. You were stuck with it.
There was no workaround. Wow.
Do you have to do a dark frame every day, or do you shoot one when you get the camera and use that dark frame forever?
Technically, we do a dark frame when we notice the temperature. Well, when we see the temperature dropping, because it's based on your ambient temperature, right? And by having a sensor that we can cool down, now they don't use water evidently to cool down the sensors. I forget what the name of it is. It's some kind of
liquid nitrogen in some cases.
Yeah, no, but there's an electronic
Peltier cooler.
That's it, a Peltier cooling system. And believe it or not, the sensors can actually be brought down to minus 40 degrees of the ambient temperature. I mean, that really does cool down the sensor. And, it's amazing what a lot of these astrophotographers can pull off.
And a lot of astrophotography cameras, like dedicated ones that are attaching to telescopes, they are still using CCD sensors, because if you cool it, it's better than anything else out there.
Let's put aside. No. I think that's super interesting. And I'm glad we're talking about it because I don't know any of that stuff. But let's just talk about general photography. There is a strong belief by many that CCD is always better. And, anytime you use a superlative, you're going to find an example where it's not true. But what do you think drives the craze for vintage CCD digital cameras today?
There's a lot of talk of it being a film look. There's a lot of nostalgia for the way cameras used to look. But I think a lot of it is when people say CCD cameras, what they really actually mean is old cameras.
Right.
Yeah.
That there's not that much inherent to a CCD sensor, and the whole CCD versus CMOS thing is really a problem of terminology more than anything. They're actually fundamentally closer than the different terms we assign them would suggest. But color science was different, and dynamic range was less, and so and not even just on-camera flash, something that you would see with a point and shoot camera that you don't need these days with cameras that are really sensitive to light, or with cell phones that don't even have a xenon flash. It's definitely a different look, and we've just sort of come to think that CCD is this magical thing when it's really just old.
I think you're absolutely right there, Stephen. Sorry, Larry, I'll just jump in here for a sec. I went to a camera market on the weekend here in Sydney, where they're 3 or 4 times a year. First of all, it was absolutely packed, and it was absolutely packed with young people, which was fantastic to see. You couldn't get through. But the one area that was really, really full of people is the Digicam section.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Stephen was going on there with, is people were after that look, that old camera look. I don't think if you ask half the people there CCD or CMOS, they'd go, I don't know what that means. But I want an old Digicam that takes the old style photos.
Sort of the same thing. My theory is that the color science, I have a fetish for Canon G series cameras like G9, G10, G11, those little rangefinder looking cameras. Don't have one in front of me right now, but
Paul, you have the G10.
Yeah.
Is that right there?
No, I got it right here.
the G9's my favorite. I don't know. the G10's got a good lens, but I don't.
G7, G8, G10, G11, they're all good.
But I think the Canon color science during that era was in a sweet spot. They were still trying to make their cameras look like film, I think. I think that was part of their goal. The CCD look is really more about that color science of that era, where they were trying to make digital cameras look filmy, but still the low light capabilities and all that the new sensors were starting to show.
And another one that was very unusual. This is a CCD camera. It was an Olympus model called an E100 RS, which is a 1.5 megapixel camera. Is a 1.5 inch CCD. It's a 10x zoom, which is unusual. But the big deal is it shoots 15 frames a second. There was nothing else that would shoot 15 frames a second. When that camera came out, it was totally unique. And it was, I think, maybe the first of the Olympus cameras that used both the smart card and the compact flash. So it had dual slots.
That E100 RS would also pre-buffer. You could set it so that when you held the shutter release down halfway to autofocus, it would start buffering shots nonstop. And then when you push the shutter button down all the way, it would then, save the last X number of frames and then so many frames after, which, now we have pro capture and we have all sorts of cameras that are doing that, but it did that the very early 2000s.
How do you know all this stuff? I mean, that's amazing that you have that right at your.
I've got an E100 RS myself. I used to sell them. I used to sell them back in the day.
That's just very cool information to have.
So how about the Foveon sensor? Where does that fall into that?
Now we're into, this is a can of worms now, the Merrill cameras.
Yeah. I had one, and I'm going to butcher this, but it took 3 separate pictures that you would have to use a proprietary software to merge to actually get the equivalent of a 45 megapixel image. But if you didn't do that, they were just regular 16 megapixel images or something. It was very bizarre. This is not a Merrill. This is called the Foveon X3 Quattro. It's a very strange shaped camera. It's called the DP0. I had 3 of these at one point. Well, 3 different versions of the DP series, but I kept this one because it was the ultra wide. This one has a 14 millimeter f4 lens on it, and it's really neat. It does make nice images, but I can't say with any certainty that it's better than other things. I just think it's different. There weren't a lot of truly unique designs and sensors, I think, and the fact that Sigma did something different maybe gave them street cred or something along those lines.
I bought into it big time when the Merrills came out. I bought the DP1, DP2, and DP3 and took them all to Ireland with me and used them because there were 3 different lenses. There were 3 different focal.
They were fixed lens cameras. You had to buy a different whole camera if you wanted a different focal length.
So you had a wide, a normal, and a light telephoto. The images were excellent. they weren't any better than any other similar resolution camera. But having to use the proprietary software to stack the files really became a problem. It just, and now you can't even, the software is dead. So you're
one of the things, because I've been to Sigma's website where I could see the old marketing material. I mean, even today, there is still a gap between a point and shoot, a smartphone camera, and a pro camera. And I'm putting air quotes, but that gap isn't as wide as it used to be. 15, 20 years ago, the difference between a consumer point and shoot and a DSLR was pretty big. And Sigma came up with these Quattro and Merrill cameras because it was supposed to be DSLR-like performance in a compact camera. But the fatal flaw was they still put a huge lens on it. So, I mean, you can't take this thing off. I mean, so for those of you at home, the camera body is less than an inch thick. It has a very large hand grip on one side in what essentially looks like a DSLR, like short zoom lens mounted to it, but you can't take it off. So while, yeah, I guess technically you could call this a point and shoot, but it's very ungainly. You can't stick this in any normal pocket. So their primary marketing was DSLR performance in a point and shoot, but you don't have any of the benefits of it being a point and shoot because you can't really stick it in your pocket.
It's also very slow to operate.
So I was going to say, you're really buying a lens and getting a camera as an attachment to it.
Really. This is the digital equivalent of the Hasselblad SWC. It's a super wide digital camera. The camera's built around the lens, I guess. I don't know. It's neat. I do like them. They are fun. I do not recommend you go buy one. AJ, don't go on eBay and look up the prices of these, especially not the Merrills.
You can get Sigma DSLRs as well. They use their proprietary SA mount and have foveon sensors. Yeah. So that's a possibility. And also they have a physically removable IR filter. So if you don't want to get a Sony F828, you can get a Sigma DSLR and remove your IR filter that way.
I've got one. I got to dig it up. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do you have to use a magnet?
No, you have to use a screwdriver.
Okay, all right. That's no fun.
But they put the IR filter right at the front of the lens mount, so in front of the mirror. And then they advertised it as a dust protector because if there was dust on that way in front of the sensor, it wouldn't show up on your photos. And the side benefit was that you could remove it and do IR photography.
A question. Here's an opinion for the room. If the digital Mavica was the watershed moment for consumer digital cameras, what was the equivalent for the pro DSLRs in terms of digital is here?
Nikon D1.
The D1. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I got the X.
Yeah, well, that's just the next version of the D1.
This was the 2002. Yeah, but I agree with you. So, Nikon bodies that I mentioned earlier, I had the Kodak DCS 420. It's the body of an N90 film camera with this huge permanently mounted device on the back.
So got the Nikon logo on the top, right?
It's got the Nikon logo on top, but it's got the Kodak logo on the back. Paul had loaned me a Nikon E2NS at one point that was built by Fuji. So it had both Nikon and Fuji's name written on it. But the D1 was Nikon's first all Nikon DSLR. And I'll tell you, the difference between the Minolta RD175, this camera's 96, I think. The original D1 was 99. This is the D1X, which is 02. But the difference between the first D1 and the Minolta is night and day. The D1, although it is a lower megapixel than we're probably used to today, the images are excellent. They look modern, just lower resolution. And that was it. Like, Nikon hit a home run with these. They proved to the world that they could make not only a top tier camera worthy of professionals, that the image quality was already starting to surpass what 35 millimeter could do. And it was in a familiar form factor. I mean, these cameras, up until the last DSLRs that were made, I know we've all switched over to mirrorless now, but even to some degree, the mirrorless is still have a design which is essentially the same as these two. So this was, in my opinion, the watershed moment for digital for the pros.
And it wouldn't have mattered how many features and how great the Minolta was. The pros weren't going to believe it. It had to be a Nikon. No. It had to be a Canon for the pros to put their career on the line with it.
Now, there's one very interesting feature that the E2 has, which we haven't talked about yet. But all sensors up until this point were crop sensors. They were smaller. No one had made It wasn't for another couple years that anyone would made the first 24 by 36 full frame digital sensor. But the Nikon / Fuji E2, the E series, still had a crop sensor, but they put like what was it, a teleconverter or some kind of optical lens inside the camera, which would change the size of the image so that you could still mount a Nikon 50 millimeter lens and still get a 50 millimeter aspect ratio. There was no crop ratio for those cameras. It was a crop sensor, but it was converting that image size so that you didn't change your focal length of the lens when you mounted to it. Whereas like the D1 you did. If you mounted a film camera lens to the D1, you had to deal with a 1.5 crop sensor. Eventually they would come out with the D series lenses, which were designed for crop sensors. But that was kind of an issue in the early days too, until people started coming out with the full frame cameras.
Nikon came out with the D3, was their first full frame sensor.
Yeah.
And when that happened, that was a game changer because at that time, the sensor manufacturing had been able to get it to the point where they were able to make it without a lot of waste. So they were able to produce a full frame sensor consistently.
The Canon Digital Rebel, is that the prosumer breakthrough about 2004?
Definitely. That broke the under $1,000 mark by being $999. And that was an absolute watershed for consumer photography and hobbyist photographers to get into it.
Yeah, everybody with a big backload with a pile of Canon lenses like myself, that was the body that took you into digital very seamlessly.
The other thing that Canon did really well was that 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens, because that gave you back your wide angle. And before that, it was pretty common for people to just use the lenses they already owned with their film cameras, their 28 to 70s. And if you were a professional photographer and you were shooting Nikon or Canon, you probably also owned a 17 to 35. And so that was great. Nikon had their 12 to 24. That was a revolutionary camera around the time, or revolutionary lens around the time of the D2. But for your average consumer, if you had a 28 millimeter zoom, that was 40, 50 some odd millimeter equivalent. So giving someone an 18 to 55 kit lens made things so much easier.
So Paul said that the D3 was Nikon's first full frame DSLR. It came out in 2007. However, trivia time, it was not the first camera based off of a Nikon DSLR that had a full frame sensor. Steven, do you know which one it is?
The Kodak DCS Pro 14N.
There you go.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
2003.
This was a Kodak branded camera. The first, this is the second version, the /N. They changed the model number a little bit. So this one came out in 2005, but yeah, the first one was 2003. It's a Nikon body, uses the Nikon F mount, but it's a full frame sensor. But what's interesting is there is a tiny little, it's hard to see in the corner, it says Nikon F mount in one little tiny spot next to the lens mount, but everywhere else, even in the front of the pentaprism, it says Kodak. They did not have Nikon's name. So Kodak sold this as a Kodak camera. And this was their first full frame DSLR, only losing out to being the first one as the Contax N1 Digital was the first all around full frame.
Yep.
Kodak also made that camera with a Canon mount, the Pro 14C.
Which was a Sigma body. The body on that was made by Sigma. So it's a Sigma camera with a Canon lens mount made by Kodak. And none of those Kodak full frame cameras use Kodak sensors. They actually had a different company make the sensor for them.
Puts aside the myth, I believe, that Kodak gave away digital cameras because they tried. They
did.
They were in there trying with consumer cameras, and they tried with professional cameras. They just didn't win.
It's an urban legend, and there's probably some truth to it. So I know there's always somewhere in the middle, but going back to the Steve Sasson story, when he produced this thing, whatever, 1974 or 75, and he showed it to all these Kodak people, and they didn't know what to do with it and told him to stick it on a shelf. They absolutely knew where this would go. They just didn't know how long it would take. Remember, you think of digital as being the switch away from film. And that happened for the pros in the early to mid 90s. For consumers, it took maybe another 10 years later. But in video, 8 millimeter and 16 millimeter fell away to videotape a lot sooner. So while videotape isn't quite digital, it's still electronic, right? You don't have to develop it. So we had already started to move away from film as a celluloid product that had to be developed in chemicals for motion picture way before still photography. And people were already seeing that the days of film, again, the real film, were numbered for video, that at some point it would happen to still too. So I absolutely believe Kodak was not ignorant. They were not dumb. They didn't try to hide anything. I think they really did a lot towards pushing the boundaries of technology, helping companies. Like, would Nikon have eventually come up with the D1? Yeah, sure they would have. But would it have been in 1999 without Kodak's help? Probably not. I'm sure that a lot of these companies would have eventually gotten there anyway, but it would have probably taken them longer if they did not have Kodak's help. Just unfortunately, it did destroy the company.
Mike, quick question though. Cinema has always remained film. Video was principally for TV.
That's true.
For television, because it's electronic.
In the late 70s, Polaroid was actually trying to do instant film for home videos. They developed a system with UMIG where you could develop your home movies that you had just shot and project them right away. And it was only ever going to be silent. And it flopped terribly because by that time, video cameras, electronic analog video cameras had started appearing, and you could do that cheaply and easily and get sound. And Polaroid had spent all this time and money and partnered with UMIG. They'd invested so much into the system, and it went nowhere and it flopped. And it was one of the things that led to Polaroid's demise. But funny thing is, what they tried to do was salvage it with the Polachrome film, which was a 35 millimeter still film that you could develop at home and get slides instantly from your still cameras. But that originally was meant to be a instant home movie format.
That was Polavision. And you shot it in their particular camera, and then you ran it through the camera a second time, and that converted the image from it, developed it, if you want to call it that.
And then did that have all the lenticular lines on it?
No, that was the Polachrome.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, that was the Polachrome instant slide films. But the Polachromes were something else. I mean, there were some scientific applications to the Polaroid instant film, instant slide film, because you could make title slides for PowerPoint presentations. There were a lot of things that was very good for some medical equipment.
Remember, a wedding photographer back in the day would sell people on, have the moments of your life slideshow, and then the last image would be a Polaroid he had shot of that ceremony. And back in the day, that was whoa.
Yeah, that was daring.
I have to imagine that Kodak saw what happened to Polaroid with video and knew it was coming for still photography as well.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Rochester because I was a stockhouse dealer as well as a digital sciences dealer. I wasn't a graphic arts dealer. That was the only franchise I didn't have. But I spent at least 2 or 3 weeks in Rochester every year at marketing programs that they didn't require you to do it, but if you didn't do it, it cost you a lot of money. So I always went. And they were they had a plan. They had a plan all the way up till the very end. They were so spread out on different products between the medical imaging programs, the graphic arts division, the hardware division. They had a lot of stuff going on, and they also owned a lot of patents. I think, and as far as dealers were concerned, we all owned stock in Eastman Kodak, and we referred to it as the widows and orphans stock because you were never going to get hurt by owning Kodak stock. And even at the very end, you didn't lose that much when you sold it.
Kodak sold a ton of 60 millimeter film to local TV stations for years and years. And then that market dried up in 3 or 4 years when electronic news gathering just kind of swept the industry. And I think they had to see that as a harbinger to what they would see in the future with their still photography because they lived through it.
Yeah, I wonder who the last guy was that said on television, film at 11.
Yeah.
The question I have is, obviously we've talked about the earlier days and the transition to DSLRs and the bridge cameras and the digicams, etc. But one thing we haven't sort of covered is that move into the mirrorless, which sort of started in the early 2010s-ish, 2014 around, I think. And probably Micro Four Thirds doesn't get the credit it deserves sometimes in that transition, because one of the earliest ones I sort of got into is this one here, which is the Panasonic GF1, Lumix GF1, and there was an equivalent Olympus as well. What was really interesting then was you suddenly had a camera that started to have traditional type feeling to it, but was mirrorless, completely mirrorless, and was accessible, easy to use, available. I've got a Jupiter 8 lens on this one at the moment, so it's a bit bulkier than it needs to be. But it's to me, that was sort of kicked off this whole mirrorless piece, which then obviously we've seen the success that Fuji has driven with that beyond that point as well. I think they're already going down that route anyway. So I think that was another watershed moment at that point, leading us to where we are now, where we're actually having professional cameras being made, which are totally mirrorless.
The movement for live view, we talked earlier, of being able to use the LCD as your viewfinder was the first step in that, right? We wanted to get away from the reflex design altogether. You're talking the Exacta came out in the 1930s. The Nikon F came out in 59. You're talking technology that was over half a century old that we're still limiting the physical size and design of cameras. So we wanted to get away from it. And one of the companies, I hate to keep giving them credit, that made the first real movement towards getting towards a mirrorless design was Sony. In around 2010, they released some versions of their alpha cameras, which they referred to as SLTs, where they used a pellicle mirror. So it was still a reflex camera, but instead of a moving mirror, it allowed part of the light to pass through the mirror, hit the sensor so that the sensor could be on all the time while still having the light go up through a pentaprism to the viewfinder. That was a very short-lived technology simply because people just said, that's great, that's what we want, but just get rid of the mirror. I think everybody kind of had that aha moment, like, we don't need to keep using this same design that we've been using forever and ever and ever. And Theo, you mentioned Micro Four Thirds, but what you may not remember is that there was originally just 4/3. The original Olympus sensors were for DSLRs, but they had a flange distance. That was the flange distance means when you take a lens off of a camera, the distance between where the lens physically mounts to the camera to where the sensor or film plane is. That's your flange distance. To have a physical mirror there, you need more space. But as soon as you go to a mirrorless, the mirror is gone. The flange distance can be much smaller, allowing for more compact cameras, smaller lenses, smaller bodies, more advanced sensors, et cetera, et cetera.
Wasn't Kodak part of that 4/3 consortium? But when it was 4/3, not Micro Four Thirds, wasn't Eastman Kodak one of the original?
They were, and they made the sensors.
Oh, yeah.
Once EVFs are good enough, the idea of having a mirror flopping around at 30 times a second is just absurd.
And unfortunately, we've again talked about Nikon is not a company that historically has been ahead of the game with a lot of new technologies. They did not want to give up the cash cow of their DSLRs, and their first, it was the Nikon One. You have one there, right, Paul?
Yeah, the Nikon One was their first, and then there were a couple of others. You have the Pentaxes.
Yeah, the Pentax Q. You guys can laugh, but I have 17 of them. I have. Hold on, let me grab more. I got a pink one. I got a green and a blue one.
Oh,
I have
you got
a gold one.
Kurt collected every color.
Black and yellow one. Or I'm sorry, yellow and green.
That's why I can't find one. You have them all.
Oh no, there were hundreds.
They made a lot of them. But unfortunately, though, Nikon's, I think they saw it as for amateurs again. They didn't get it. And while the Nikon One wasn't bad, it had a really tiny sensor. And these Pentax Q cameras have an even smaller sensor. Like, it's so small. I have an adapter on this one here that's C-mount, the Cinema C-mount. So the Pentax Q, for someone who's not here now, is smaller even than the original Olympus Pen half-frame camera. And I have a lens here, which is a Kern Palliard Switzerland from a Bolex mounted to it. And there's almost no crop factor. So if you want a digital camera to shoot cine lenses with C-mounts without a crop factor, this is the camera to have. But the flaw in it, though, it's so small. And because of the era in which it was made, the LCD is a relatively low resolution. That manually focusing on this tiny ass camera is really hard. Very, very hard. When you use the lenses that were made for it, autofocus is fine. But we've become accustomed with modern Fuji, Canon, Sony, Nikon. I love my Nikon Z5. You focus peaking. We talked about this in the very last show. There's a lot of things you can do to accurately focus manual focus lenses on modern mirrorlesses. But these Pentax Q series cameras, it's really, really hard. In the image quality, it's very tiny. I mean, it's got poor low light performance. And I think that kind of is what suffered from the Nikon One system as well, too. People wanted DSLR-like quality from their mirrorlesses. And Sony laid the groundwork, but they got it right perfectly right out of the gate with their alpha mirrorless cameras. And they still do a very good job of them.
I think Nikon really dropped the ball because you're adapting lenses to those Pentax Q cameras. You can even put D-mount lenses from 8mm cinema cameras on those. You can focus them, you can set the exposure, and you've got image stabilization from the sensor. But if you adapt lenses to a Nikon one body, at least the early ones, you can't even set the exposure because they will not show you the exposure that you're going to get. It always just gives you a bright, nice image. And when you take the picture, it's horribly underexposed or overexposed, and you have to do trial and error to set the exposure. So the one thing that maybe would have had enthusiasts like those cameras of adapting oddball lenses to them, they kind of killed it with the design.
Yeah. Nikon missed twice. The first one, I blame them. The second one, I don't think anybody saw coming. The first one was they did not accurately predict how much demand there'd be for mirrorless cameras. They just waited too long. The second one, though, that nobody could predict was this shift to smartphones. iPhone, Samsung Galaxy, whatever you have, this is what 99% of all photography is taken on these days. And let's be honest, they do a good job, right? For pictures of my kids, random pictures of forest, whatever. Oh, see, look at that bird on the tree. Go get a picture of it. You grab your phone and you're going to get a decent picture from it, right? I've even had people tell me, like, Mike, why do I even need a camera anymore? My smartphone does a great job. With AI, all that goofy shit you can do with night view, and it like layers like 18 pictures on top of itself and gets you one exposure that is perfect. I mean, it's just amazing what smartphones can do. But what Nikon failed to understand was that almost the entire digital camera market would disappear. And like today, I don't know what the stats are. I don't know if one of you knows it, but the amount of sales of true digital cameras today is borderline unsustainable. I'm amazed that Nikon and Canon are even still in. Canon doesn't surprise me because they're such a diversified company, but I just don't think Nikon has the widening range of products to suffer the market of traditional cameras disappearing.
Nobody's ever going to shoot the Super Bowl with a cell phone.
No.
So there's always going to be a market for professional photographers.
You say that though, because I mentioned my trip to my photography in Kenya a bit earlier. I saw a post recently in one of the forums where someone had said they'd actually just gone onto a safari in Africa and come back, and they said they were surprised in their group. He or she was expecting a lot of people with cameras with long lenses, etc. They were the only one that turned up with what they were calling the white lenses. So right. Everybody else was there with their mobile phones. So we sort of say, oh, you're never going to shoot the Super Bowl with that. I say one day maybe you will.
Yeah, but I mean, so unfortunately, let's be honest. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have used a Nikon Z mirrorless. They're really nice. I love my Z5. I've seen the Z9 in person. It's a fantastic camera. They did a great job with it, but it was, in my opinion, too little too late. For one, Sony and Fuji too, and even Olympus. Sony, Fuji, and Olympus got so far ahead of Nikon in terms of mirrorless development. But in addition to that, by the time Nikon got the message, the market was just drying up. And sales to anything but pros is like non-existent.
Nikon and Canon were on the fence. They were always on the fence with mirrorless cameras. I know to the day that the Z came out, I argued with my rep and I told him, dude, there's no reason to have a mirror in a digital camera today. No, AJ, no. And then when I talked to him afterwards, when the first Z50 came out, he turned to me and it was the Z7 and the Z6. He told me, AJ, I'm never going to go back to DSLR.
Right.
And I told him, I said, why have you been arguing with me for the last 4 years about it?
There's only one thing, because I still have a couple Nikon DSLRs too. I know Paul, you have an 800, I think. There's one area that DSLRs are superior, that mirrorlesses aren't even close, and that's battery life. You at least have hope with a DSLR of a battery lasting through a whole shooting session. Whereas I tell anybody, if you're going to buy a mirrorless, go get a crap load of batteries because you're going to need them.
Mike, I'll tell you.
AJ's disagreeing.
I did weddings for 20 years. When Sony upped the battery on the A7, after the A7 III, okay, I can do one battery got me through 2/3 of my wedding day. And my wedding day started at 8 a.m. until 2 in the morning the next day.
Well, that's a big battery too, though. AJ.
That's a big battery. Yeah, I have one here somewhere.
You don't got to have a mirror, so you got room for a big battery.
And here's the battery of the A7 III.
That is huge.
Right?
Okay. Well,
which is
besides that one, the most digital, like this, I have an Olympus Pen F digital, awesome camera. Yeah. Love it. The battery on this, I took it on Saturday. Now it is older, so I'll at least give you that. It could just be, diminished capacity. But I charged it up yesterday. I took it to my sister's house for my dad's birthday. I shot maybe 80, 90 pictures on it, and the battery is already at like halfway. Yes. Don't get me wrong, it didn't die on me. I got through the day, but I shot 80 pictures. Mm-hmm. This would be a camera. I would have battery anxiety if I didn't have multiple batteries. Whereas with a DSLR, I had a Nikon D7000 for 10 years, and I had one battery for that ever. I would shoot it as long as I needed to. Whenever I was done, I would just plug it into the charger, wait till I needed it again. And sometimes I could go weeks without recharging the battery, and it was fine.
One of the things when we look back at all these vintage cameras we've talked about, compacts, DSLRs, is that nobody ever made any money selling them. The companies making them never, ever turned a profit. All through the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, they were always losing money just trying to build market share. And some of them are very vague, but we can look at corporate reports and see, yep, they were losing money, that whole division. But even Sony has come out and said that every single DSLR they ever made after they bought Konica Minolta's assets lost money. Mm-hmm. Every single NEX camera they ever made lost money. Every compact camera they ever made lost money. The Cybershot ones, they lost money on everything. The only time Sony made a profit on cameras was the RX100 series, and then the Alpha 7 series. And so now we're looking at mirrorless cameras that don't have autofocus systems, so they're mechanically simpler, they're cheaper to make, cheaper to assemble on the manufacturing lines. Companies that didn't have the technology to do that could make them. And we have incredible prices like $6,000, $4,000 for a high-end mirrorless camera. We're finally at a point where these cameras are turning a profit for the manufacturers.
At the same time, everybody's using their smartphone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not everybody, I know. So, okay, we've gone into some incredible history. I have learned probably more in this episode than I've done in a lot of episodes. So I want to thank you guys for that too. But I want to have a chance to have everybody go around the room and just bring up one camera. Let's evoke some gas for listeners of this show. Think of, while I'm still talking, one camera that we haven't talked about that's like either your favorite, or maybe it's just a quirky camera that you've enjoyed using, or something that you think is interesting, because I certainly have mine. But I want to go over, I always love going back and reading old articles of the past, like when you would see 1950s Good Housekeeping articles where they would predict what living in the future would be like, flying cars and the Jetsons and stuff like that. And I always find it interesting to see what were predictions from the future but from the past, and see how close they were to getting it. When I used to do my Kepler's Vault series, where I would go back and find old articles, and I would have scans of them where you could reread them, but then I would kind of talk about what was in the article. I found an article from February of 1986 written by Herbert Kepler. Kepler made several predictions about the future. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read them, and I'll give kind of my thoughts and let you guys think, whether you agree with it or not, of what he thought would happen. And keep in mind, Herbert Kepler was one of the biggest authors. He was one of the most respected voices for camera reviews, articles and such like that. He was in the industry for many, many, many years. So he obviously had his heels entrenched in film. So in this article, again, February 1986, I'm going to read his quote. First one is, some new electronic techniques are going to be applied to regular silver halide emulsion imaging that will give you image quality with present cameras far superior to what you have now. So what he's talking about, electronic techniques like digital manipulation. what I think he's saying there is he's predicting that we're going to be digitally manipulating pictures to give better image quality than what you could get now. In essence, he's predicting Photoshop, right? I think the first version of Photoshop didn't come out till 1990. So he's 4 years ahead of this. And I would say that the idea that you could shoot a picture back then and then later manipulate it to improve that image quality, which we take for granted today, that was probably pretty far-fetched, right? So what do you guys think? Do you think that that's a pretty accurate, prediction?
Well, you're certainly right about Photoshop, but what about, remember Cytex or whatever that was? That predated Photoshop, didn't it? Because I remember.
Oh yeah. No, there were others. There were other image softwares. I'm just saying Photoshop, the one we
had workstations in the mid '80s. Yeah.
Because I remember Rick Smolin got into a big because he manipulated a photo from his day in the life.
But go back to the 60s, 70s and say, hey, one day you're going to take that image from that camera and you're going to use a computer to make the image look better. They'd think you were crazy.
Oh, yeah.
That was right on. I think he was accurate there. All right, here's the next one. The images made are primarily designed to be shown on TV. Again, he's talking about electronic cameras then. So the images made are primarily designed to be shown on TV, which may not be the place where you want them. Photographers want prints. And if they're slide film users, they want to project pictures on a large screen where all detail can be seen. So I rated that both a hit and a miss. Like, he's correct that people don't want to see images on the screen, but that's only true when you're thinking of 1986 televisions, right? He hasn't seen a 65-inch, OLED, widescreen television, or Black Friday is coming up and there's all those on Amazon, those laser projectors now that can project like a 300-inch image, and stuff like that. And he obviously has never heard of a smartphone that has, granted it's a small screen, but with pixel densities of incredibly high resolution. So he missed that, obviously. But what I think he got right, though, was that he at least saw that electronic images were tied to televisions, or AKA screens, which back then, if you looked at a picture, you had to print it. The old photo albums, you'd have a family function and mom would go out and grab out the photo album from the previous Christmas and everybody look, or you'd hook up your slide projector and project on a screen. That's how you shared photography. And the idea that you would one day show them on TV, he thought photographers wouldn't want to do that. But in a way, I think the opposite's been happening, right?
And if you looked at early digital cameras, a lot of them came with an analog video output cable so that you could hook it up to your TV and show your pictures that way. And a lot of people did that. But I think also companies were including those cables long after people stopped doing it.
They stopped doing it for sure. But yeah, there was a switch at which the day of when you no longer wanted to print pictures and you viewed them on a screen was a definite prediction that I think he saw. All right, here's another one. The electronic camera today simply cannot record enough information to provide pictures with sufficient detail. Additionally, there is a growing number of technicians who feel that the quality characteristics of an electronic image may never match that possible from silver halide material. So on the surface, he's saying it may never match. And obviously, I think we could all agree that digital sensors, and again, we're only talking about 35 millimeter here, digital sensors can far out-resolve.
I think we have a dissenter in the crowd.
No, I'm sorry.
No?
I'm sorry.
But hold on. I think you're going to agree with the next thing I'm going to say, though.
Okay.
His exact words, where there is a growing number of technicians who feel that the quality characteristics, he's not specifically saying sharpness or detail. He's talking about the characteristics. And I think that's kind of where you're going, AJ, is that film still has a look that digital was never able to capture.
Yes.
And that people are still going to want that. So he's making this prediction in 1986. It's 2024. And we still see that there are quality characteristics of film that digital never matched. So in a way, he was right. He was right.
That I agree with.
He probably didn't understand how sharp things would get, but the quality characteristics, I agree with you, AJ. I think that he was right in that one there too. Here's one. We will need a still electronic imaging system offering between 4 million and 6 million pixels for a usable electronic still camera system with sufficient detail in the images to make good professional prints. Such a system rivaling 35 millimeter may not be available until way past the year 2000. He almost nailed that one.
He almost nailed that one.
Yeah, because I would say I bought a camera in 2004 called the Canon PowerShot S2IS. It was like their super zoom camera. It had a 5 megapixel sensor And I remember when I got that camera and I was looking at some of my images and I was like blown away, like, wow, these look really, really good. And Kepler in 1986 was predicting between 4 to 6 million, which I think that's it. Like below 4 megapixels, in my opinion, you can tell it's an early digital camera, right? But between 4 and 6, at that point, your 3x5, maybe 4x6 prints really don't look a whole lot different.
The other thing, Mike, Stephen asked this question on a person aside here, that the Nikon D1 was a 2.7 million megapixel camera. But how many pixels did it actually have? Because there was a big difference between how many it used and how many the sensors actually had. What was the answer to it, Stephen?
It's actually a 10.8 megapixel sensor.
Really?
And yeah, in 1999, they had a 10.8 megapixel sensor, but there was no way for them to process that much data. So when they made the Bayer filter array, they put each red pixel covered 4 pixels of the sensor, each green covered 4, each blue covered 4. And so it was a quad Bayer sensor. The thing we're now seeing in cell phones that the OM system OM1 recent digital SLR has, or mirrorless camera has, that quad Bayer sensor technology existed in 1999.
Wow.
And that was true of a lot of other cameras too. They would say, how many megapixels has this? Well, what they're really asking is how many does it use? The sensor was a lot more than what the camera was capable of using at that time.
But I would say 4 to 6 million was that, I'd say, that transition point to where, compared to 35 millimeter, you could start to see like we've reached that equilibrium sort of. And then he says such a system rivaling 35 millimeter might not be available until way past year 2000. The D1 did come out in 99, so he wasn't right there. But the D1, when it first came out, I looked it up and it was 5,350 when it first came out, body only.
The Nikon D100 really was the camera that was the first that hit the price point and was 6 megapixels.
And that was what, 2002?
Yeah, that was about right. Yeah. 2001, 2002.
Okay. So it's hardly way past 2000, like he said, but I'd give Kepler he was pretty close on that one. And then the last one, and this one sounds like a duh, but I think about it for a second. And his quote was, since electronic images can't be compared directly with film in terms of graininess, pixels are used instead. Film pixel counts are equivalents. And you guys are like, of course that's true. But what I think is cool about that is no one used the term pixel back then, right? Like you didn't talk about megapixels. That was such a foreign concept, I think, to someone in 1986, especially someone just reading Modern Photography magazine. What was the point at which digital photography equaled that of a film, 35 millimeter film? Now, answer that same question for medium format, and it goes out the window because you have 6x6, 6x9.
Yeah.
You have the Fuji 6x17. I mean, how many megapixels would it take to recreate the Noblex 120, or a banquet camera?
Well, we went from 640 by 480, which was the old way to describe the resolution of something. And we went away from that and we went to megapixels. And that's where you get in trouble, because if you really want to compare them, you compare the resolution in those terms rather than in megapixels.
And here's another thing too, to think about, like if I were to look at a film negative and then compare that to a digital camera image, which one's going to look better? Before you answer that question though, you have to ask, well, how did you look at the film image? How did you get it? Did you use your cell phone and take a picture of it in front of a widescreen? Or did you use a flatbed scanner? Or did you use a dedicated 35 millimeter scanner? Did you use a Noritsu dedicated film scanner, a Heidelberg Tango drum scanner? I mean, how you scan in the image affects how it looks, right? Like,
absolutely.
How did they make an HD 4K print of The Wizard of Oz, film from 1939? We're able to extract more detail out of film than we used to back then too. So film has actually gotten better over time.
Yeah.
But of course, digital has too. So that's a loaded topic, and I didn't mean to be that deep in it.
But even today, if you get you've shot film, you drop your film off to be developed and printed. If physical 4x6 prints, chemical prints, if that's on something like a Fuji Frontier, that's digitally exposing that paper.
Exactly.
Like you're not projecting it optically. That negative is being scanned, and a laser or an LCD screen in some
Exactly.
there are mini lab systems that all they are is an LCD computer monitor that is placed up against the photographic paper and recording that image. So you're getting a digital image no matter what you do.
Exactly.
There's a company in my hometown that very proudly makes what they call optical prints. It's just an old, uh, from back in the day, and I've used them. It doesn't look that much different, but I remember noticing years ago, if you look closely at your little 4x6s, you'd see the little square pixel image things.
All right. So it was a great little thing there. Again, I think it's interesting whenever you look back at an article from the past and how they predict the future. He got some things right. He got some things wrong, but he was close on at least all of them. Go around the room real quick before we get out of here. If you guys have been thinking, give us an example of one digital camera. Hopefully it's something not super mainstream, but something that you value, you think is worthwhile camera to own, shoot, historically significant, something like that. Let's start with Theo.
I'm saying this in the hopes that someone will actually send me one to keep. It's the Leica M11. I think it's an important step at the moment because it's actually competing in the world of high end cameras used professionally, while retaining a lot of the history and the way of actually shooting and a traditional type lens system. So to me that is something I'd love to have.
I will tell you, I handled one and I was terrified of holding it. It was so valuable. I did not want to walk around with that thing around my neck. All right, Mark Faulkner, give us an example of what you got.
Most of my digicams we covered tonight, but I really love this little Pentax W90. It's got LED light ring built into it, and it does macro shots really well. And it's also supposedly waterproof, probably not these days. But I love taking this out and just taking close-up shots. But as far as the larger one, I also have a Canon 1DS Mark II, which I enjoy shooting.
Pat Casey?
I already mentioned it. It's pretty mainstream though, is the Canon Digital Rebel, because that was the breakthrough. Got a bunch of Canon lenses, it's still thoroughly usable today, 6-point-something megapixels, if I remember correctly. So,
Will Pinkham?
First of all, I'd like to say I really miss slideshows, so I'm glad that came up. But I think the Epson RD1 has always been the one camera I want to hold, use, function with, and never have.
Mike has one of those.
My camera that I was going to share with you guys is the Epson RD1. Yeah, this is probably as close to an M11 as I'll get. Really like this camera. I have talked about it before, so I won't go over too much with it. But the cool feature, there's a lot of cool things with the camera, but the really cool feature is it still has a wind lever. It's got a shutter that has to be mechanically cocked. So you're not advancing film, but you are winding it to tension the shutter so that when you press a shutter release, the shutter can fire, exposing your image. And it's got the analog dials. This is the most analog digital camera that's ever been made. A lot of fun, great images. It has a great CCD sensor. I don't understand why, but I'll just tell you it does. And it's a shame that they didn't continue on that series because it would have been fun to see what an RD2 might have been like.
I wish other manufacturers had kept that type of camera going.
Yeah. And the body's made by Cosina. So this is very similar to the Bessas, but this camera is heavy. I mean, it feels like German, this could be a Leica. It is a stout, all metal, does not feel cheap at all.
They're going for $2,000 US on eBay.
Yeah.
That's why I don't have one.
Most people don't.
What I really want is something that doesn't exist. It's the holy grail. I want a little 35 millimeter cassette that has a full frame sensor on the end of the leader that I can put any camera that I own. But until somebody makes one of those, I'll take a phase one.
I got one that's made out of Legos, if you want.
I like that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantasy that everybody has, and people have tried. You gotta just keep in mind though that even if somebody does come up with one, and even if it does everything you do, it's still not really recreating accurately the analog experience, because how do you couple that to the shutter release? But you're right, it would be neat if something like that existed and it worked as well as we think it should in our minds, and it was full frame, yada yada yada. AJ, what do you got?
I'll be honest with you. The very, very first time I had in my hands was the Pentax 645, the digital. I did a session, a studio session with it, and I couldn't believe the detail that came out of that camera. The first generation, I'm talking about the first generation.
Yeah.
That for me, that turned digital photography around for me.
Is the GFX what you would say the modern day version of what you would consider that camera was
Yes.
at the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
And as far as popularity goes, the GFX, here in Montreal, or I should say Quebec, the Pentax has not really been the most popular in the last, I would even say the last 6 years. Fuji's done something that just kind of blew Pentax out of the water, at least here in Canada.
All right, Miles, Slayback.
I don't have that much knowledge in this department to share, but I have in the last 2 hours purchased Apple Quick Take.
All right. Well, he wins the award for this episode.
There we go.
You're going to want to find an old Mac.
I bought the one for Windows.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Nice.
So
That's very cool.
we'll see.
Now I have a feeling it's gonna be a difficult question for him to answer, and I saved you for last, Steven. But do you have a favorite or significant camera you want to promote?
You see, I'm not going to mention a camera because the last thing I need is for another camera to become popular and have everybody thinking this is the new hot, social media, TikTok, podcast, exciting thing, YouTuber camera to get. And that's driven so much of like the Digicam collecting, and people want the trendy cameras. But the stories that I love the most are hearing when someone has like dug up an old camera that their parents used that was abandoned in a drawer, and they're bringing that back to life and going out and shooting with that because there's history and there's memories with that. And even if it's not that specific camera, if they can track down that their family used to use a certain model of camera and pick up another one of those, I think that's kind of a really rewarding thing, because I have so many cameras now that I don't really use, but I've also started retiring cameras that once I've used a camera for a trip or a special event or something, memory cards are cheap, cameras are cheap. I just leave the card in it, put it on the shelf, and that becomes that camera from that event. And if I want to see those photos, I back them up on my computer, but I can go back to that camera and look at those pictures on that camera, have that tactile link of handling that camera that I handled at that special event or trip or something. And so even though it's totally dodging the question, I think the most desirable question or most desirable camera should be something that has a personal relevance to each person, and not what the influencers are telling you should buy.
That's a good answer. Nobody asked me the question, but of all the digital cameras I own, the one that I use the most actually over the past year and a half is the Ricoh G900.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I thought of it is because it's similar to the one Mark held up. And the reason why I've used this one so much is it's underwater. This is a waterproof camera. I have taken this to water parks with the kids. I've gone in swimming pools. We were in the Grand Canyon. We were swimming, and we were jumping in the water, and I would time the kids hitting the water underwater, and it does a really, really excellent job. It's got a built-in GPS, so it'll encode your location of where the images were shot. It does a great job even with just above water pictures too. So this is definitely my vacation camera right here, and I have shot this camera more than any other digital camera in probably the last year and a half. So we could drive that one up. And then I'm sorry, I know I said I was done, but one more. I forgot I had this sitting here. Has anybody seen the wooden Nikon rangefinder?
No.
It's a Nippon Kugaku. It's made out of wood.
It actually works.
This was a weird curiosity I found from Kurt. I don't know where he got it from, but somebody carved in wood a body that looks very much like a Nikon rangefinder, but it's a Sony Alpha camera inside of there. It's hard to show you, but if I take off the battery compartment, you can still see the old digital cameras in there.
Oh,
it uses regular Alpha batteries. It even has a Sony NEX mount on it. There's the mount for it.
Basically a coffin for a little camera.
It's a little, exactly what it's coffin. But I put a Nikon adapter so that I could mount. I have a Nikkor 2.8 millimeter or 2.8 centimeter lens on it. So kind of a weird, I don't know where the hell this thing came from.
Once again, cool. Mike wins the nerd contest.
What you basically have is the prototype for the Hasselblad Lunar, which was they took a Sony NEX7 and covered it in wood and bling and things. And
Paul and I each had one. The Stellar. It's called the Stellar.
I had 3 of them.
Oh, you did?
There was the Stellar. I think the Stellar was the RX100 and the Lunar was the NEX7.
Oh, I didn't know they made more than one.
Yeah.
I had the Stellar.
B&H, when they closed those out, they were actually sold by Hasselblad. They had Hasselblad's name, but were made by Sony. And when B&H closed them out for $1,000, it was the best deal you could buy.
They're beautiful cameras.
I think Kurt
beautiful.
got them.
And when you say Hasselblad Lunar, I think something completely different.
Right. Not the moon camera.
Unfortunately, it was just a cosmetic rebadge of the RX100, the original RX100. But it had like a champagne body with like a real leather body covering. Even the wrist strap had a Hasselblad H like stamped out instead of holes in it. I mean, it was really elegant. It was one of those cameras. It's like so nice, like an anniversary edition Leica. It's like, who wants to use this? It's so pretty. But functionally, it's just an RX100. All right, guys, this was great, actually. Anytime we dive into digital, Steven, you asked me the question, how well does digital perform on the show? I do say a lot that the film photography podcast, I probably should stop saying that because I do love digital. I don't shun digital at all. I incorporate it into my daily routine constantly. Paul mentioned at the top of the show that 40 millimeter Alpha lens that he's got, the kill fit, right?
Yeah, the macro key lens.
That exact lens, for anybody who reads my site, every time you're looking at a beauty picture of the actual camera I'm using, was shot with that lens. So while they are digital photos, I feel like I'm giving it kind of a film vibe by using a genuine film. In fact, every review, even before I used that lens, I used to use a Takamar. And even before that, I used a Nikon, I think a 35 millimeter f2.8 lens too. So I've always tried to incorporate digital and film together. I love adapting lenses. I think that we're at a point now with digital where there's a lot of these cool cameras like the Sony 828, the Epson RD1, the Pentax Q series. There's a lot of really cool ones. I mean, unfortunately, they are electronic cameras, so they're going to suffer the same rigors that we're seeing with the X-Pan and some of the 90s and early 2000s film cameras, where one day they may stop working. So if you're into collecting and you just want a different segment of cameras, I think that there's a lot of really great models out there for digitals, and pick them up while you still can.
I'm looking at an FD90 right now, the Mavic.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun, man. I mean, getting those images and putting them on you're going to have to go on Amazon if you don't already and get a USB floppy drive to be able
I got 2 of those.
Okay. All right. You're good then. All right. Well, I want to thank you guys. This week is Thanksgiving in the US, so it really has no impact on the show, but 2 weeks from now, we're already in December. I had said in the last episode, we didn't really know when the next one was going to be, and it ended up being 2 weeks anyway. I don't know when we're going to do the next show. I don't know what it's going to be about. We still have some ideas and some future shows we want to do. It's going to start to get a little weird in terms of the cadence of these shows until we get through the holiday season. So I don't know when episode 83 will be. I don't know what it'll be about. But as always, the topics and discussions on the Camerosity podcast are influenced by you guys. We need you guys to join us, talk to us, educate us, teach us things, ask questions. No prior collecting or shooting experience is necessary. We love talking to beginners and grizzled veterans equally. But thank you guys for coming, and everybody have a great night. And for those of you in the U.S., happy Thanksgiving.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Good night, and happy Thanksgiving all to you in the U.S.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
The next great conspiracy. New Zealand is disappearing off world maps. Disappearing. It's all over the internet. What?
Hello, Reese.
Cindy, Your Majesty, I'll keep this brief. New Zealand is being left off world maps all over the world.
I'm sure there is a reasonable explanation.
I don't think so. I've been searching the internets for the last 30 seconds and it's everywhere. This is a major conspiracy. I'm going to get behind it. By that, I don't mean support it. I'm going to actually, sort of get in behind it. Not in a rude way. I'll go around the side of it, but I'm going to search it out. I'm going to study it. Leave it with me, my lady. Zealand, where the bloody hell are you? Australia. They're stealing our tourists. Our wine, sacre bleu. Sneaky Frenchies. You missed it off by accident. Are you sure? Or is England trying to get rid of the All Blacks once and for all?
That was fast.
Of course, Your Highness.
Jacinda is fine, Reese.
Listen, this is big. Bigger than we thought. Bigger than the moon landing and Loch Ness combined. Which, by the way, is one of my theories, that those things are combined. Now look, I've boiled it down to a few things. Australia want our tourists, England want to get rid of the All Blacks, and the wine industry, they can't beat our Pinot or Sav.
Are you sure?
Well, I do have one more theory. We're quite a fiddly-looking shaped country, a bit like a half-eaten lamb chop. Perhaps people are just leaving us off, thinking we're a mistake.
Reese, I've got to go.
I know, you're short of time. Okay. Now, do you want me home to report back to the nation? Because I can be there in 3 movies and a meal.
Look, Reese, you might be onto something, but we're going to need some help.
How's things anyway? What's the buzz on the beehive? Hello?